Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
And now, the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton, sponsored by GEHA.
Welcome to the Federal Drive on Federal News Network. It's Monday, June 22nd. I'm your host, Terry Gerton, and I'm glad you're here. Coming up on this hour of the Federal Drive, the Marine Corps has a plan to make sure its data is treated as a service-level asset. Plus, a new House task force is taking aim at everything from free speech to federal programs. And for a lot of organizations, the level of scrutiny may be surprising. Those stories and much more ahead during this hour of the Federal Drive. We begin with this. The public's overall view of civil servants is trending upward, along with increasing public support for a nonpartisan federal workforce. Those latest findings come from a new report from the Partnership for Public Service. The nonprofit is also picking up on a continuing trend of many Americans disapproving of the Trump administration's cuts to federal funding and the federal workforce. For more on the survey results, Federal News Network's Drew Friedman spoke with Paul Hitlin, Senior Research Manager at the Partnership for Public Service.
Each year, we've been asking people questions about their perceptions of civil servants. Two of the questions we've been asking are, do you agree or disagree that civil servants are competent? And do you agree or disagree that civil servants are committed to helping people like you, members of the public? And what we found this year is that both the positive ends of those questions were the highest they've been since we started measuring in 2021. So this year, 65% of the public agreed that civil servants are competent, and that was up from 57% last year. We found that 61% of people agree that most civil servants are committed to helping people like me, up a few points from 56% last year. And as I said, we've been doing this for a while now, since 2021, and those were the highest marks we've seen over that time. So there's a lot of potential reasons for that. We're not 100% sure why, but what appears to be clear is that attacks from the Trump administration on the civil servants are not harming people's views of the civil servants, and it may actually be backfiring in a way. People may actually be learning more about what civil servants do, what the federal workforce does, and at least in some small ways, improving their views of what the federal workforce does.
And you said you don't know exactly the reasons why it's changing, but do you have any, from your focus groups or discussions or anything, is there any general sense you can give me of why that might be?
I'll have to be cautious in that and saying we don't know for sure. What we hope, and we've seen this anecdotally, is that has been a lot of news reporting on when certain people are laid off or when programs have been cut. There's been more reporting about the workings of those programs than there have been in years past. Sometimes it takes something to be closed down for it to get a lot of attention. So what's possible is that people are learning more about what these various agencies and departments do or have done when they get cut. And that may contribute to what the public understands about people and who they see as the federal workforce.
Another important part of that civil service section of the report is obviously the views of how important it is to have a nonpartisan civil service. And it looks like those numbers are rebounding, maybe not necessarily to 2024 levels, it looks like, but can you talk about, what you saw in that trend and if you have any ideas of why there has been that shift?
So what we've found is that this year, 76% of Americans agree that a nonpartisan civil service is important for having a strong American democracy. That is a pretty high number as is. 2 years ago, in 2024, it was even higher. It was 87% agreed, which is about as universal you're going to get on anything. Last year, there was a bit of a dip. It dropped down to 66% before rebounding 10 percentage points this year. There's definitely has been throughout even 66%, there's definitely been, a large majority of the country that believes in a nonpartisan civil service and sees value in that. We think last year that a lot of that dip came among Republicans as the Trump administration changed some of their hiring rules and some of the other civil service protections. And so we think that had an influence on the views of Republicans last year. This year, it has sort of rebounded closer to levels it was before. Again, we're not certain why. It's possible that attention to, as I said before, attention to some of the agencies that have been cut, or some of the stories of programs that have been ended, that has contributed to a greater understanding of the value of a nonpartisan civil service. We know that broadly the public does not think the Trump administration's cuts have been particularly effective. So it's also possible that they see that what has come out of these cuts and changes have not been positive, and so maybe the idea of a more partisan workforce is not actually beneficial. Again, all of that is conjecture, but I would again emphasize that the 76% is pretty high from any point of view, any way you look at it. So there's pretty widespread agreement that a nonpartisan civil service is important.
You also mentioned, Paul, a minute ago, just the views on the effectiveness of the Trump administration's cuts. And I know the report talks a lot about that and just opinions on how the administration is managing the federal government. Can you talk about, what you're seeing in terms of the trends of, how the public is responding to what they're seeing from the Trump administration here?
Well, what we've found is that the majority of the country opposes the Trump administration's changes to the federal government. 52% of people say they oppose, only 39% say they support, with another 9% saying they're unsure. These are very similar numbers to what we saw last year in 2025. So there's been consistent opposition to the changes being made by the administration. We also asked people, do you think that these cuts have made your lives better or worse? Far more people say it's made their lives worse than better. Only about 1 in 4 people say it's made their lives better. And there's a large percentage of people who don't know. But in general, people are saying these cuts are having a negative impact. Certainly the majority of people are saying that. We also asked people, do you consider the government wasteful? This is something we've asked year after year. There was actually a big increase from last year to this year. So last year, 61% of people said the government's wasteful, which is a high number. That number shot up to 75% this year. So what we could take away from that is it's pretty clear that the Trump administration has not convinced the public that they've made the government less wasteful. There could be whole reasons for why that increased, but it does not seem to suggest that they've won over the public in thinking that DOGE and other efforts have succeeded in cutting waste. And connected to that, we have also been really interested in people who support the Trump administration's efforts, trying to understand what it is they support about it. And what we found is that by far, people who supported the cuts are really focused on trying to make the government more efficient and save money. Very few people who support it said that they were really interested in giving the president more power. The issue of finances and efficiency was overwhelmingly the reason why people supported those cuts. So we think that's a really important point, too, that the effort to change the civil servants into something potentially more political doesn't seem to be the reason why people who are supporting the efforts, why they're in favor. It seems to be, they believe or hope that the cuts will create new efficiencies. There's evidence that so far that hasn't happened. There's more government spending this year than last year. But that's really what we found why supporters, who were mostly Republicans, are in favor of the changes that are happening.
You also mentioned a little bit about impacts and how people are, feeling the effects of some of the changes here. And I know that you guys have done research about this before, about, just how much they're feeling the changes or the cuts to government. Was there any research in that area in terms of like the types of impacts people are feeling, whether it's on a personal level, job level, community level?
About 1 in 3 Americans say that they or someone they know has felt the impact of cuts to government. There's a wide range of observations. And what's also important to remember, what we've learned, is that people in the public understandably tend not to make a lot of distinctions about government cuts versus government shutdowns versus some of the other things that are going on. So when we did this survey, obviously inflation has been a big issue now for a while. We actually did the survey while there was a partial shutdown of the Department of Homeland Security, and TSA lines were quite long. So a lot of people were mentioning things like that as issues that they've witnessed as a result of the cuts. Now, again, we know that the public doesn't make distinctions whether a TSA line is long because there was a cut or because there was a shutdown. To the understandably to the American people, why that is not necessarily important. To them, it's all the federal government not serving the people as well as it should. But to answer your question more directly, we heard a lot of people tie cuts in with inflation and issues with the economy. And because of the timing of it, there was definitely a lot of people who said the TSA lines were a problem. There were some people who've talked about it being harder to reach Social Security help, veterans benefits. There's been a number of articles written on that, and we heard some of that from the people we surveyed as well.
There's still many Americans who indicate they are uncertain about the consequences of the way the Trump administration is managing government. Can you just tell me a little bit more about, what you noticed there?
For a lot of our questions, we get high numbers of people who say they don't know to answers, which is not generally unusual. But we find that there tend to be higher for questions that we ask about the government than for a lot of other questions in other surveys. We attribute that to a lot of people don't know much about the government, and they don't know a whole lot about specifics about cuts or management of the government, and especially among political independents. We find high numbers of people who will not give an answer. They rather than give an opinion, they will say they don't know. And we understand and that the inner workings of the federal government is not something a lot of Americans think much about. And that's the challenge with a lot of the work we do, is trying to educate people. And we also want to meet people where they are. And so they don't spend a lot of their time thinking about agencies or Schedule PC or these types of things. And that's reflected in the percentage of people who answer they don't know to a lot of our questions. We also think it's a potential opening for the partnership and for other organizations that want to communicate the value of the civil service and federal work. A lot of people may have little conception or not a lot of preconceived notions about what it means to work for the government or what the government does. And so there's an opening there for people to communicate and explain why the work the federal workforce does is really important to helping the American people.
You may have already just answered this with kind of what you just said, but I'm curious if if people are reading this report, what's the main thing that you'd want them to understand or to know from these findings?
The main thing is that the way the Trump administration is managing the federal government is not popular in the country. In fact, the majority of people are opposing the changes that they're seeing, particularly the cuts to the workforce and cuts to government programs. This opposition has been steady for the last year. And while there's some partisan differences, Democrats and independents are very opposed to how the Trump administration is handling the management of the government. It appears that in many ways the Trump administration is out of step with the country in terms of what the public wants from their federal government. Broadly, wanting efficiency and being good with resources makes a lot of sense. And there's always places where that could be improved. But the haphazard nature of the cuts and of the workforce is not a strong way to be smart about the government. And the public is indicating that they understand that as well.
Just out of curiosity, do you have any other research coming up? Are you going to be looking into this more?
We've been studying overall levels of trust in government. We've been doing that for a while, so we will have a report coming up in a couple months focused on that and focus a bit more on the trends we've seen since we've been doing this since 2021. And we're going to continue to monitor public opinion, over time to see if there are changes in how the administration is managing the government. We find that this work is important because it is a different angle than most survey organizations use. There's a lot of surveys done, as you probably know, about the political angle of do people support, who they might vote for. What we're focused on is the management of government and the inner workings of the federal government. And so the questions we ask and our goals are slightly different. And that's, we think, pretty important. We think that's a subject area that's not covered as much as the politics. And so we're definitely going to continue this work for the foreseeable future.
Paul Hitlin is Senior Research Manager at the Partnership for Public Service, speaking there with Federal News Network's Drew Friedman. Find Drew's full story at federalnewsnetwork.com. Up next, the Marine Corps has a plan to make sure its data is treated as a service-level asset. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network.
Tune in Tuesdays at 10:30 a.m. and 2:30 p.m. for the Innovation in Government Show, sponsored by Carasoft. Hear from the industry leaders advancing the technologies shaping how agencies modernize secure operations and deliver better services. Innovation in Government covers what is changing now, what is working from cybersecurity and cloud to data, AI, and emerging technologies. Listen to Innovation in Government Tuesdays at 10:30 a.m. and 2:30 p.m. on Federal News Network. Search Innovation in Government.
Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. The Marine Corps has developed a roadmap to meet the goals outlined by Secretary Pete Hegseth in his January memo to become an AI-first warfighting force. Through 5 key initiatives, the Marine Corps is turning the Secretary's strategic intent into tactical reality. For more on how the Marines are operationalizing their data and embracing a data-centric future, Federal News Network's executive editor Jason Miller recently moderated a conversation at the AFCEA Nova Navy IT Day with Colin Crosby, the Deputy Commandant for Information and Service Data Officer for the Marine Corps.
First, we're implementing digital transformation teams. These are not collateral duties. These innovative teams are delivering for their commands. They are our agents of change. Second, we are piloting an AI accelerator through the implementation of our AI fellowship program. The Secretary's memos call for pace-setting projects to deliver tangible outcomes. The AI accelerator is being explored as an engine for this. It is focused on rapidly developing, testing, and implementing AI models for high-priority warfighting needs. It's about moving from theory to fielding, turning what if into right now. Third, at the core of our entire effort is the data orchestration layer. This directly answers the Secretary's mandate to unlock our data. Fourth, we are fostering innovation and collaboration. The Secretary's guidance emphasizes that innovation cannot be centralized. We are actively engaging with industry, academia, and our partners in joint and coalition space. Finally, none of this happened without the talent to build it. The Marine Corps Software Factory is our organic capability engine. It is where we cultivate the digital talent required to build and sustain modern software-defined capabilities. The Software Factory provides the developers, engineers, and coders who will build the application and services and put AI in the hand of our Marines. Each of these initiatives is interconnected and represents our comprehensive, service-aligned approach to meeting the Secretary's challenge. This is how the Marine Corps will achieve AI dominance and secure our warfighting advantage for the next decade and beyond. And this brings us to our final slide and to the entire purpose of our force design journey. We have talked about the architectural imperative, the strategic mandate for AI, and the key initiatives the Marine Corps is driving forward. The slides show you what it is all for. This is the why. In 2020, the Marine Corps announced a major force design initiative referred to Force Design 2030, which is now known as Force Design. It was a plan to redesign the surface for naval expeditionary warfare, in particular focusing on strategically competing with China. All throughout the concept are theater agnostics. Force design initiatives are informed by 2 operational concepts: littoral operations in a contested environment and expeditionary advanced base operation, both which are set for the Marine Corps to better support naval fleets and the joint forces as its eyes and ears. Look closely at the legend. The green dots represent our Marine stand-in forces, small, lethal, low-signature units operating in the adversary's weapon engagement zones. They are our forward eyes and ears, rich with sensors. But just as importantly, look at the purple icons, our notional joint force and coast coalition assets. This is the reality of modern conflict. We do not fight alone. We fight as a combined, integrated naval and joint force. This image is not a static map of units. It's a dynamic picture of a fully networked, data-driven ecosystem. The true power of this map isn't the individual dots. It's the invisible lines of data connecting them. It is the ability for the Marine stand-in force to pass targeting data to a joint asset, for a coalition partner to provide a critical piece of intelligence, and for a commander to have a complete, real-time operational picture fused from every available sensor. This is what we're building. An integrated mixen is an architecture that allows us this seamless, signature, secure, and rapid exchange of data across services and even across nations. Our AI-first strategy provides the cognitive engine to make sense of this massive data flow, to identify threats, and to create decision advantage at machine speeds. And our service-aligned initiatives, from the digital transformation teams to the software factory, are the engine rooms building the components, the talent, and the processes to make this vision a reality. Our journey is about transforming these individual assets from being merely in the same theater to being a part of a single, cohesive, and lethal cognitive network. This is how we will deter, and if necessary, how we will fight and win.
So there's a lot to go over, and maybe I'll back us up to maybe the front end of your speech a little bit. And the sensor to share data to decisions is really the route you said you got to perfect.
Right.
The challenge of doing that is we got plenty of sensors.
Yes.
Way too much data.
Yes.
And everybody wants to make a decision.
Yes.
So how do you kind of get that through line? What, from your perspective as the service data officer, how do you help make that through line connected, integrated, interoperable? So not everyone's making, each piece is so different, so non-connected. How do you connect those dots?
It's definitely a joint operation, a partnership, right? And I believe, from my perspective, it started at the acquisition piece of it. When you acquire these capabilities, you have to make sure that you have access to that data that asset is going to capture and all the data, not just specific pieces of the data. So being in the room, being a part of that decision making is the first stage of that. And then as we go forward, we have to also change the mindset of our organization and how we view data, how we treat data, how we collect data. The importance of data is always a continuous learning aspect for us. And once we continue to do that, it helps us to strengthen the importance of data as we capture the data, learn how to store the data, and utilize the data effectively by having trained individuals, trained SMEs, having the right tools in order to do that, and then in order to then deliver the outcomes that data is going to give.
We've been talking about data for so long and this idea of how important it is,
Yes.
right? I always like to tag back to the moment back in mid-2000s where, data, data's the new oil, right? How many times do we have to hear that? I'm going to say it because I enjoy saying it because it's still true today. But so how do you connect it with the acquisition? Are you finding that, okay, now you're getting invited, you're getting that seat at the table, you're sitting in when the acquisition planning is happening? We heard some speakers earlier today talk about some potential contract opportunities, some changes. When the Marines do that, are you saying, hey, bring Dr. Crosby in here or your team in there to make sure that they're having the right conversations at the beginning of the process?
Right. Innovation is not centralized, right? So we have these organizations that are leaning forward. From the release of our AI strategy, we have had organizations that are leading the path. And the Marines, we're the Marines. We're going to say, got it, and we're going to move out. And that has been the mentality. And that's what I've seen. The acquisition community is leaning in. And they are now understanding our capabilities organization. They're leaning in and they're understanding. Everyone is leaning in to understand, okay, we understand now the importance of data. And I don't think data is the new oil, personally. Data has always been that foundation. No matter if we can go back before technology, we go back to any conflict, you always need that intelligence, which comes back to data. It's always been there. Yep. And so now, as we look at moving that data quickly, or it's starting to understand its importance, as we can move it instead of weeks or months to get information, we're getting information in seconds. And so that's the importance of what data makes to the decision commanders need to make.
Colin Crosby is the Deputy Commandant for Information and Service Data Officer for the Marine Corps, speaking there with Federal News Network's Executive Editor, Jason Miller. You can hear their full conversation at federalnewsnetwork.com. Search Ask the CIO. Still to come, a stretch of Capitol Hill work is shifting from debate to decisions. But first, a new House task force is taking aim at everything from free speech to federal programs. And for a lot of organizations, the level of scrutiny may be surprising. You're listening to The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. A new House Oversight Task Force is investigating how organizations handle issues like free speech, DEI, and federal funding. With hearings now underway and a tight deadline, the focus is shifting from policy debates to how these decisions are made and documented. Here for a look at what that process actually looks like are Kim Ham and Carlos Uriarte, co-chairs of Morrison Foerster's Congressional Investigations Practice. Kim and Carlos, it's great to have you both on the show. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having us. We're really happy to be here.
Kim, let's start with you. Congress sets up task forces all the time, but this one, the Defending Constitutional Rights and Exposing Institutional Abuses, seems to come with a pretty broad mandate around free speech, DEI, and immigration programs. From your perspective, what are you seeing that's really different about this task force?
Well, in many ways, this task force is just focused on the same key issues that other Republican-led committees have been investigating in recent years. In some ways, it's a clearinghouse for these issues. I think what's interesting and important is when it's happening. This is happening in the lead up to the midterms. This task force is only authorized through mid-November, and they've chosen as a head of the task force a young Republican member who has a number of viral moments at hearings and on social media, who I think is seen as a good messenger to bring some of these issues that are being investigated by all the committees to the people in advance of the election.
So do you have the feeling that it is going to be more spectacle than substance?
Well, I think it's already been substantive. And, I think the intent of what the task force chair has said and the chairman has said is to come up with policy recommendations. But I do think the messenger here is someone who gets a lot of attention for being, effective and aggressive at hearings. And that was a deliberate choice.
Carlos, with the setup that Kim has just given us, when you look at the scope here, who should realistically assume they might get pulled into being a witness for this task force?
Yeah, so far they've really started with focusing on the state government entities as targets for the investigative requests. We have other private sector individuals coming in for the hearings. But, it's going to be the whole suite of potential targets, companies, universities, nonprofits. As Kim said earlier, a lot of these investigative requests or investigations are continuations of issues that Republicans in Congress have already been looking at. And so, I think those same entities that have been seeing these requests over the past few months are going to continue to see interest, including from the task force.
So, Kim, this sounds like there may be a parade of repeat witnesses, but for folks who haven't been through this before, walk us through what actually happens. How does this inquiry begin and how quickly does it escalate?
Well, in a typical investigation, you might initially get a letter from the chairman requesting documents and information. You may get a request to come in for interviews or briefings. The committee might issue subpoenas if they feel that the documents or information isn't coming in quickly enough. And then there's a hearing, and you might see some interim staff reports or final committee reports. That said, this one has to move very quickly, right? It's only been authorized, as I mentioned, for 6 months. And the first letter that they sent was in mid-May. They've already had a hearing that happened on June 3rd. So for this one, I think we should expect a pretty compressed timetable and for the task force to be following up on letters and demands for information very quickly. The chairman of the task force has also already said that the subpoena authority is on the table for them, and I think we should look for that as well.
Does that pace or pressure cause any concerns around the lack of normal legal protections?
Well, that's always a concern with congressional investigations. Witnesses and targets retain their constitutional rights, but the procedures are so different, and some of the typical things that would be available, like judicial review and things like that, are quite different. And so when things move quickly like this, I do think people have to be on guard and careful about how they're responding.
Carlos, then let's follow on what Kim just talked about. How is a congressional task force investigation different from, say, a DOJ or an SEC investigation? And how do organizations need to prepare differently?
Well, a congressional investigation, as you alluded to, is not like other kinds of investigations. They oftentimes happen in very public ways. They move very quickly. And because so much of the investigation is happening in the public sphere, and because there's no norms around confidentiality, companies should expect that the information they share with Congress, will become public, even if not immediately, at some point in the future. Another way in which they're very different is that there's no neutral arbiter of the facts. To the extent that there is someone to appeal to, it's going to be, through those public media narratives that the organization can get their own facts out into the public sphere. But Congress is going to have a lot of prerogative in terms of how that plays out. And there's no one to adjudicate disagreements. At the end of the day, the committee gets to decide so much of how things proceed in a congressional investigation. And so, understanding the norms around congressional investigations and understanding what rules do exist to help govern those congressional investigations is really important, because that's where companies going through these investigations will have leverage and have the ability to, help push back where necessary on Congress. But again, these are very different than other investigations. And so, I think it's important for any organization facing congressional investigation to know, where to turn to when they get these types of requests, knowing that it's going to be a different experience for them than other executive branch investigations.
I'm speaking with Carlos Uriarte and Kim Ham. They are co-chairs of Morrison Foerster's Congressional Investigations Practice. Kim, let me come back to you. We touched a little bit at the beginning of our conversation as you were describing this task force on whether it was spectacle or substance, but there are pretty significant policy issues on the table here: DEI, speech, program integrity. How much of what they're hearing already and what you expect them to tackle will actually inform future policies?
Well, a congressional investigation at its core is not a law enforcement investigation, and the Supreme Court has been very clear that it cannot be seen as a law enforcement investigation. The actual committee that this task force sits under itself has a very narrow legislative mandate. It is primarily an investigative committee, but the way it works is that its findings would be used by other committees for legislation. We are very late in a Congress, so any legislation that would come out of the findings of this task force we're looking at potentially the next Congress. The chair of the task force himself has said that the goal is to create policy recommendations for the broader Republican conference. But he's also said that the purpose of the hearings is to stop fraud, for example, and to build a case that DOJ can take up. So it's important for people who get caught up in this to understand that, these findings can be shared with the Department of Justice and that there could be these parallel investigations happening at the same time.
So, Kim, let's follow up with the organizations that, as you said, might get caught up in this investigation or these hearings. What kind of decisions or practices in their own organizations are most likely to draw the attention of this task force?
Well, it's really the same issues that we've been seeing for the past few years. And, those same, corporate practices or institutional practices around DEI, around allegations of bias or content moderation, those are really the same issues. And so, I think companies, institutions, colleges are already kind of aware baseline of that. I think from a decision point of how you deal with this task force, the timing is really important. What degree of cooperation do companies or institutions want to have right now, given that it's late? There really are these competing pressures given the timing. The target of an investigation wants to run out the clock because they want to see what happens in the election. And the committees want to get something out in October. And the incentives can be different regarding cooperation if you think that there's going to be a majority change in the House. So while the types of activities the companies have been engaged in are the same types of activities that have been investigated really since the start of this Congress, how companies or institutions respond to the task force is informed by the timing here.
And Carlos, let's follow up on that because Kim's described this tension. Do I want to be responsive and timely? Do I want to kind of run out the clock here? If you think you might be called in by this task force, what should you be doing now, maybe before you even get a letter?
We work with a lot of organizations who that they're potentially going to be the target of an investigation because of the nature of their work and the nature of the types of investigations we've seen from Congress. And for a lot of those organizations, one of the things we'll do is work with them on conducting a comprehensive risk assessment. And that's something we can do under privilege, which I think is incredibly helpful. And it's an opportunity to look at a whole host of practices across the organization, including corporate hygiene around internal and external communications. And what you can do is to really understand, where your vulnerabilities are as an organization, what are the potential, areas of concern from a risk perspective, and then to take steps, in collaboration with counsel to mitigate risk to the organization so that if you get a request, you have a plan of attack for how you're going to respond to that request. And I think the companies and organizations that have gone through that exercise, who have a plan before the request even comes in, are best situated, I think, to take advantage of the kind of strategic considerations that Kim walked through earlier, right? Because they already know the sum and substance of what they want to say. It's just a matter of, what is the best way to engage with Congress through the investigation.
And Kim, as these hearings get underway, what are you watching for to see how aggressive this committee is actually going to be?
Well, we're watching closely to see how many more letters come out, how quickly they use the committee's subpoena authority if that happens, but also watching the hearings themselves. As I mentioned, the head of this task force is a young Republican member, has a reputation of being very prepared at hearings, very direct, very aggressive questioner, a lot of viral moments. We would expect that to be the tone of these hearings going forward. And in fact, in the last hearing they had, their first hearing, one of the witnesses said that his question nearly brought her to tears. And so I think we will expect to see more of that type of questioning.
I've been speaking with Carlos Uriarte and Kim Ham. They are co-chairs of Morrison Foerster's Congressional Investigations Practice. Thank you both for joining me and walking us through this interesting opportunity.
Thank you. We really appreciate the time.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Coming up next, a stretch of Capitol Hill work is shifting from debate to decisions. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Several issues that have been building in Congress around foreign policy, intelligence authorities, affordability, and federal funding are now in windows where action is possible. The timing is different for each, but the possibilities are clear. And here to point out the progress and the obstacles is Deputy News Director for Bloomberg Government, Lauren Duggan. Lauren, it's good to see you. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Never a slow week in Congress. And last week, of course, the president was in Europe for the G7. And we had the signing of the Iran MOU. The Senate is making noise about wanting to confirm or validate that. What are you hearing and what exactly is their role when it comes to international MOUs?
Well, I think it's two steps, right? First is oversight, which they clearly have and clearly want to do. They want administration officials to come up to Capitol Hill and tell them what's in the deal, what it means, maybe what it doesn't say, and it needs to, because some of these things are secret and behind the lines, right? But then the legislation that was put in place many years ago around the Obama Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action nuclear deal is still on the books. So we'll see if there's more agreement, and this is meant to be an interim agreement while they have more talks about the nuclear program. That could be subject to a vote certainly in the future, depending on what way they go and how Congress responds. But what we've seen so far are a lot of questions about what elements of the MOU mean, what it means for the future talks, and those will continue once lawmakers get back into town.
And those questions have really been bipartisan. What does that imply in terms of the president's support here?
They are bipartisan. Some key Republicans had some big questions. Roger Wicker, who's the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, was one of the people who had some pretty tough questions about it, what it meant and what some of the line items in that MOU meant and what it meant for the longer deal. So there is some skepticism. There will be questions about lifting sanctions on Iran. There's not a lot of trust for Iran in Congress. That is bipartisan and decades long concern about what goes on in that country and its nuclear program. So, there are tests here potentially for the administration going forward. And some of those could turn into legislation that they want to move. The NDAA might be a prime target to debate these questions, and we're going to see action on that soon. So there's definitely opportunities here for Congress to weigh in, short of even weighing in on the deal itself.
Right. Not only the NDAA, but Reconciliation 3.0, where there might be a defense supplemental for this war. I mean, so really, as you see more Republicans raising questions, does that make the potential for progress of these other sorts of defense-related bills and funding more questionable?
Yeah, defense spending is in a kind of tricky spot because the president wants $1.5 trillion for the next fiscal year. He asked for $1.15 trillion the normal way through regular appropriations, $350 billion through reconciliation. So bills are moving in Congress on that $1.15 trillion part. The NDAAs in both chambers start with that figure. We'll see a defense spending bill go through the House Appropriations Committee with that. But the $350 billion has a lot of question marks. The whole reconciliation question is tough because there's not a lot of time. There could be one focused on defense, like we just saw for Homeland Security. But if you're moving a third package, lawmakers are going to want to put more in there. And there's not a lot of time. There's a lot of potential inclusions, and it'll take a lot of political will and agreement to get that over the line. So things are very tricky in the defense funding space at the moment. And time is the greatest villain here, I think, for people trying to get a lot done in that space.
The other big tricky spot is Intel. Lots of fireworks on that last week. We thought we had a path through to the FISA bill, and then the president turned that sort of upside down. Walk us through the D&I nomination, withdrawal, the FISA Act, and kind of where we are there.
Yep. So the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act had key spy powers that expired back on June 12th when Congress couldn't agree on a short or long-term extension of those powers. One of the things that was holding that up is the president's appointment of Bill Pulte, whose day job has been head of the Federal Housing Finance Administration, to be the acting director of national intelligence starting on the 19th. One of the things that Congress wanted was who's going to be the full-time replacement. We want to know what the path ahead for this is. And the president nominated Jay Clayton, who's kind of a known figure. He was the head of the SEC in the first Trump term. He's been in charge of the Southern District of New York office for the judiciary, for the Justice Department, which is a major job. And it seemed like that nomination was on the glide path. Maybe a hearing Wednesday, maybe even confirmation by the end of the week. But from Europe, the president said he wanted that hearing canceled because he wanted the replacement for SDNY to get a hearing. So, wow, that's a lot of moving pieces there. But where it left us was no action right now on FISA, no action on Jay Clayton's permanent appointment, and kind of a stalemate while Bill Pulte took over. There's a lot of questions here, again, on a bipartisan basis about Bill Pulte, what he might do at the agency, and we'll be looking at that. But in the moment, FISA doesn't seem to have a path forward until they unstick some of those other things.
Lauren Duggan is the Deputy News Director at Bloomberg Government. And Lauren, I guess the real-time implication of the loss of those spy powers is we're in the middle of World Cup and other sorts of major international events, and the intel community can't quite see those comms, so they're worried.
They are worried, and we had a piece that used those events as kind of a framing for why that expiration is worrying some folks. But a court order that has allowed collection is still going forward, and it seems like there hasn't been an immediate disruption in that space. But we'll see if that continues to be the longer this goes on. But people don't want to leave those powers expired in the long term, so we'll see if there's some effort to rejoin here. There's some recesses coming up here around July 4th that might put pressure on lawmakers to get things done as well.
There is one bill that's moving forward, and that's the housing affordability bill. The Senate has now approved the 21st Century Road to Housing Act language that's starting to move forward. Sounds like we might actually get a compromise here. What would that mean?
Yeah, that's an old-fashioned bipartisan bicameral compromise where
What?
each side talked. I know, right? I mean, they each talked to each other and they traded versions back and forth. House passed a version, Senate passed a version, House, and now we're back to this compromise. But there are provisions here to direct HUD to take steps to open up housing, and then there's other provisions that each chamber wanted and finally agreed to. So a ban on institutional investing that the Senate really wanted, a temporary ban on the Federal Reserve issuing a central bank digital currency that the House really wanted, and then some other language that moved back and forth, like a package of community banking bills. But this housing legislation will be significant. People will take a victory lap when this gets over the line. It looks like there's a path for it to get through that final Senate vote on Monday and then through the House later in the week. But it will be a pretty significant change in housing policy that people are going to tout.
And it comes just before the 4th of July, so folks will be back in their districts maybe making some headlines around it.
Absolutely. People will want to take that, go to picnics, and talk about the bill that they just passed.
There is another set of legislation that's getting some more attention, and that's around AI. Certainly, the administration's actions around Mythos and Fable 5 last week raised the temperature here a little bit, but there are a number of bills going back and forth. There's the No Fakes Act, the Kids Online Safety Act, the App Store Accountability Act, all kind of floating around trying to find a balance between oversight and innovation and safety. As you watch those all kind of circling up there, where do you see the potential for compromise?
Increasingly, we're seeing these issues come together into one big puzzle. And a lot of this comes down to, should there be a national framework for AI regulation or the state-by-state approach? So lawmakers are discussing that issue, and then they're discussing some of these other tech issues, which include regulation of the social media networks. And what do you do about deepfakes? What do you do about protecting children online? Do you have verification rules? And that's all coming together in one discussion. What we've seen is Marsha Blackburn, a senator from Tennessee, has been talking to the White House, and I think those talks have been including members of the tech space about what can they get working together. Whether that will yield legislation before the end of before they get to the summer break or by the end of the year remains to be seen. We've also seen the big packages come out in both chambers that are major frameworks. The Obernolte-Trahan bill is a bipartisan one in the House that was released a couple of weeks ago to get discussion going. So I don't think there's consensus, but there are a lot of things happening, sometimes in front of the lights, like approving the No Fakes Act in the Judiciary Committee, but increasingly behind the scenes and in rooms where people are having meetings.
So maybe we can keep our fingers crossed that there is some potential for that old-fashioned compromise and conference negotiations. As we move into the summer, though, the bills that are on top of all of our audience's mind are the appropriations bills. Where are you seeing committee work and where are you seeing progress?
The House has done a lot of committee work. In fact, if they keep to their schedule, by the end of the week, their 12th bill will be out of committee, and they can check that work off their to-do list for the summer. Now, getting them through the floor, a little more difficult. They've passed 2. They may do 2 more this week and get those over the line. The Senate is due to start having markups this week. They're planning action on 4 bills. One of the stumbling points there has been they wanted a bipartisan agreement on top line funding in the Senate before they marked up. They scheduled that markup before they had that agreement. So either that could push that agreement along, or they might take a more one-sided approach than the Senate panel likes to do. They really want those bills to come out bipartisan in the Senate because you need 60 votes to get them through. So you might as well start out with that is kind of the work they do. So a lot of stuff is happening. The markers will be laid down. That doesn't mean we'll see an agreement on finalized funding anytime soon. I presume we're headed towards CR discussions in September, a continuing resolution, because, shutdowns will be on top of mind here when we come back in September, and there's going to be great interest in averting one of those, I would think, on both sides.
Well, there's few work days left to watch, so we'll keep an eye open and see how they do.
It's going to be a very busy couple of months.
Lauren Duggan is Deputy News Director for Bloomberg Government. We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Earlier this year, President Trump announced restrictions on executive pay and stock buybacks as part of the administration's push to speed procurement and revitalize the defense industrial base. Now lawmakers are looking to codify his executive order into law. Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis joins me this morning with more details. Anastasia, great to have you.
Hi, Terry.
So this is a proposal in the Senate version of the NDAA, right?
Yep, that is correct.
What does it say?
So it's Section 815, and this provision would effectively create a ban on stock buybacks and paying dividends for companies seeking to work with DoD unless they obtain a waiver by committing to invest in the defense industrial base. So the measure basically says the defense secretary cannot enter into any contracts unless the contractor agrees in writing that they will not buy back their own stocks. They will not buy back stock of a parent company, pay dividends, or make any other capital distribution to shareholders. That can be waived if the contractor agrees to what they call a qualifying defense investment plan that is approved by the Secretary of Defense. If a contracting officer finds an allegation that a contractor is doing something wrong, they immediately notify the contractor of the violation, and then there is a remediation path. However, if a contractor no longer meets the requirements, the Defense Department can suspend payment under the contract, it can revoke the waiver as a whole, and it can terminate the eligibility of the contractor to receive progress payments. Lawmakers also want the DoD to provide a list of all contractors granted a waiver and the justification for this waiver, and they also want a list of contractors that violated their agreements.
That's a lot of very specific provisions. How different is that from what was in the executive order?
Yeah, so the executive order, it targets defense contractors who are, and I quote, underperforming, not investing in their own capital, not sufficiently prioritizing U.S. government contracts, whatever that means, or whose production speed is inefficient as determined by the secretary, while at the same time engaging in stock buybacks. So earlier this year, the department said that it completed its initial review following the executive order, and they said that they identified underperforming contractors in those who are failing to prioritize warfighter needs. Again, we don't know what that means, but at the time, DoD said that many defense contractors came to the table to negotiate a deal for accelerated production. The Senate measure says that DoD cannot enter into a contract unless the contractor agrees in writing that they will not buy back their own stock. And the EO, of course, doesn't have a requirement for an investment plan. Also, one thing that the executive order addresses, it's the executive pay compensation. The executive order wanted to cap executive pay at $5 million. The Senate Armed Services Committee didn't even touch it. They solely focused on stock buybacks. And, when the executive order came out, it received criticism for being a little too ambiguous. How do they determine, how do they measure whether a company is performing well or underperforming, whether a pet company is investing inadequately? There is no mention about kind of the responsibility that DoD has for cost overruns and program delays, things like that.
Is clearing up that ambiguity what's behind the Senate's additional provisions?
I think so. I think the lawmakers wanted to codify this into law, but to put a lot more kind of restrictions around it.
Did the House introduce anything similar in their version?
Yeah, the House Armed Services Committee did not include a provision to codify Trump's executive order, but Congressman Chris Deluzio, he offered an amendment that would prohibit defense industry from buying its own stocks, but he withdrew it due to some jurisdictional issues.
Do you have the sense that on the Senate side, this has bipartisan support?
It does have bipartisan support, definitely, but it's another question whether it survives even on the Senate floor.
And what are industry groups saying about it at this point? There certainly was a lot of comment when the EO initially came out.
Oh, absolutely. lawmakers will face blowback from the companies to which this applies, and it's companies like Lockheed Martin and Boeing. Industry groups immediately pushed back. They started pushing back when Deluzio introduced the amendment that didn't even make into the House's version of the bill. But immediately, for example, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce said it believes, and I quote, any legislative effort to codify the executive order's provisions through stock buyback restrictions would significantly exceed the president's stated intent and transform a targeted policy directive into a blunt and overreaching statutory mandate. And they said that these restrictions on this practice represents a flawed and unwarranted intrusion into free market, and it would not actually address the underlying issues that the executive order wants to remedy. At the same time, the Aerospace Industries Association said that there will be less capital to invest, there will be less companies wanting to work with the Defense Department, and ultimately, many companies will exit.
It sounds like we're in for some interesting conversations around this provision. What's next?
Like I said, we'll see what happens. We'll see if it even survives on the Senate floor. But what we do know, it will definitely face a strong pushback from industry. There is a good chance it will not make it into the final bill.
That's Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis. Anastasia, thanks as always for the update.
Thank you, Terry.
You can find her story at federalnewsnetwork.com. The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton is produced by Eric White and Michelle Sandiford. Our web editor is Stephanie Wright. For the latest updates, stay with federalnewsnetwork.com or follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. I'm Terry Gerton. Thanks for listening.